Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back, and today not so much with how to command the Death Guard. This is more of a general take on the state of 40k as a whole, and my take is free Wargear is bad for 40k. Now this isn't going to be exhaustive, so I'm sure there are plenty of you out there that will, come to a point that I haven't thought of. Please do feel free to continue the conversation in the comments. Whether you agree or disagree, I would happily continue the discussion. So I will read those and I will get back to you. But my takes here, I've got a few points for you. First and foremost, Wargear is not equivalent. And so making it all one cost, i.e. free, is not representative of the equity within that weapon. They are not equivalent. Armour of Contempt going away is a huge buff to Storm Shield, so any loadout that includes a Storm Shield or any option that allows the inclusion of a Storm Shield on a model is a huge buff. And that's because previously Armour of Contempt did not apply to a model with a Storm Shield, and so it would be either include the Storm Shield and get the +1 to your save as well as the invuln it offers, or don't take it and have Armour of Contempt as well as whatever else you would do with those points instead. Because again, at that point, a Storm Shield would typically be costing you around 5 points extra per model that was equipped with one. Now, when we look at something like a Power Sword versus a Power Axe, that is as close to as possible to equal, in that you're really only moving a pip of AP to a pip of strength, or vice versa, depending whether you're going from the sword to the axe, or vice versa. But when we consider the likes of a Thunder Hammer versus a Power Sword, they are simply not equal. And that's because if we have this one model and they've either got a Power Sword or a Thunder Hammer and they need to deal with an 8 wound model, the Power Sword cannot kill that model because the maximum output with 4 attacks would be 4 wounds. The Thunder Hammer could kill that model and it would need no fewer than 3 attacks to do so. Now, whilst the Thunder Hammer is less likely to get through the hit roll, as we'll come on to later, supporting Thunder Hammer units isn't particularly difficult for Marines, and so you can mitigate that to an extent. But the fact that it has that larger damage output, higher strength, so once you get through the hit roll, the wound roll is going to be that bit easier in most cases. Ultimately, the Thunder Hammer wins out. So when we're considering for Marines, Intercessors can take a free upgrade on the champ, it's going to be a Thunder Hammer. Assault Intercessors can take a free upgrade on the champ, it's going to be a Thunder Hammer. All of the time. You are not going to take a Power Sword unless you've built the model that way and you want to play WYSIWYG. But again, you're not looking at it from a point of view of trying to maximize output and be competitive, which is not so much within the scope of this particular reason why free Wargear is bad. So my point here is that not only has Armour of Contempt gone away, but Storm Shields as a result are better off, and then making them free, or in some cases just cheaper, ultimately is a double buff to the Storm Shield. And for one of the units we'll talk about later on, of course, it all rolls into one because we're gonna address Thunder Hammer Storm Shield combo. So both the Thunder Hammer itself being better and the Storm Shield being better means that those units that can use both potentially get a double buff. Now, in context of the Death Guard, obviously the Plague Marines, they can only take so many of each weapon. I would never be an advocate for saying, oh, can we take 10 flails? Because the unit would need to cost like 300-400 points. It just would cease to be the unit it is. However, with the 2 flails, 2 cleavers, fist, mason axe, 2 melters, and 2 blight launchers, a 10-man squad of Plague Marines does quite consistently outperform a squad of Blight Lords, even with their free upgrades, and it can outperform squads of Death Shroud, depending on the target. Death Shroud do have some good opposition choices in terms of having that dual profile to fit the needs as they may be. But largely speaking, Plague Marines come out on top within Death Guard for having that free Wargear, and that leads us into one of my next points in a moment. My next point here is list building limitations. So as we've already established, Wargear is not equal. A bolter and knife is not equivalent to a plasma gun and power fist, for example. Being unable to take a cheaper squad, a cheaper alternative to that unit, means that you may be in a position where you cannot include the unit you wanted and needed to hold a back point, to work on a secondary, to act as a screen. Whatever it might be, whatever use case in the list, you may be in a position where you cannot run the unit you want simply by virtue of having already paid for Wargear upgrades that you might not have wanted to take in the cost of that unit. Death Guard can only round up points in one of three ways. Now, you can cut the sponsons off of a Predator, for example. If you're running a Predator, I would argue it's probably just because that's the model you've got. You just want to play it today. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But again, when we're talking about the wider context, there are a lot of people out there that don't want to play to lose and will take the option that is better, if you like, and as a result be forced into a certain set of parameters because they don't want to take something that's flat worse or generally worse. So Death Guard can only round up points in one of three ways if we ignore some of the vehicles that I wouldn't consider a typical mainline Death Guard unit. So with that being the case, you can round up and down points using Poxwalkers, but that does mean you are now limited to taking Poxwalkers if you want the ability to flexibly increase or decrease points in increments of 5, Poxwalkers of course being 5 points per model. One of the only other ways, now that, for example, bloat drones, free Wargear, so you've not got the option to shave 5 points off if you need to. One of the only other options is Plague Burst Crawlers. You could switch out the Entropy Cannons for Plague Sprayers, but arguably the Entropy Cannons are one of the main reasons to run a Plague Burst Crawler, so it's unlikely that you would want to do that. And the third and final way would be via Deadly Pathogens, which of course you can only cut from your list if you've already spent the points on them. So for an example, if you wanted to cut a tally man of 65 points from your list in order to fit in a Blight Spawn of either 80 points base or 85 if you take the common Deadly Pathogen of Viscous Death to reroll the sprayer hits, you would either need 15 or 20 points. For argument's sake, I'm going to say 20 because I find that pathogen to be almost an auto take. You cannot find 20 points in a Death Guard list unless you have a squad of Poxwalkers that has at least 14 models to cut 4 of them, 2 Plague Burst Crawlers to cut the Entropy Cannons down to sprayers and save yourself 20 points, or by cutting pathogens that already exist. Which means if you are not running pathogens already and you are not running Plague Burst Crawlers, you are obliged to find room for Poxwalkers in order to cut them down by 20 points to then be able to fit this model in. When in an ideal world, we would have some kind of option, whether it be Blight Lords, whether it be Death Shroud, whether it be Plague Marines, to reduce the cost of a core mainline infantry unit and still fit that unit in our list, but with a loadout which is arguably worse for a cheaper cost. One way of fixing this, in my opinion, it would at least solve this problem. Perhaps wouldn't let you get the pathogen in, but if we had a squad of 5 Plague Marines with the upgrades, they're coming in at 95 points. If it were the scenario that a squad of Plague Marines base was 80 points, I think having the fist on the champ being free is completely reasonable, and then 3 points per upgrade. So you want a plasma, pistol, or gun on your champ, 3 points. Cleaver, 3 points. Flail, 3 points. Blight Launcher, 3 points. Melter, 3 points. That costs 15, takes you to the 95 where they would be at now. Because factually, the squad of Plague Marine with Bolter's Knives and a fist on the champ versus the squad with the Melter, the Blight Launcher, the Flails, and the Cleaver and the champ, it just loses that fight pretty much every time unless the dice decide for you. So having the option to cut that 15 and make the squad worse would allow you to cut a tally man at 65 points, to throw in a Blight Spawn at 80, and you are not then limited by the functionality of free Wargear in the choice of your list, forcing you into Poxwalkers. So in the case of Death Guard, I think it's more apparent on the grounds that the troop slot is very narrow and the mainstay choice has free Wargear and no option to become cheaper. This is less true for Marines, I would say, but still true. If you're using troops in Marines, you can very easily find any iteration of 5, 10, 15, 20 points by just knocking them to the next cheaper option. You could cut intercessors down to assault intercessors. You need to find 10s, infiltrators down to intercessors, 2 squads of intercessors down to 2 squads of assault intercessors. Again, you can find those iterations very, very easily. However, if you're running more of a skew build, or you're running a faction that really wants to lean into its elite choices, for example, Blood Angels, now that they're getting free Wargear on Sandguard, there is no cheaper Sandguard option or more expensive Sandguard option to be able to spend points on a meaningful upgrade in the form of the Fist, which again isn't always going to be better, but in some scenarios will be. It gives that unit a use case going to the heavy quality targets. They don't have that now, and so if you were fleshing out your list with the maximum number of elite slots and some fast attacks, all of which that have now free Wargear, you are limited in the amount of ways you can add a chunk of points. Yet you could go with the command upgrade, but let's say you've only got 15 points spare, you can't afford the command upgrade that you wanted, and there isn't a way to cut units at the exact point total to make up that difference. So you end up cutting one of your Sandguard out entirely, making up 30 points. You've now got enough to go with your apothecary or whatever upgrade, but now you've got some left over again and you can't spend them. So again, it's less of a case for Marines that are running troops, but Marines that are not running troops, or at least not enough to flexibly add and take points away and fit the need of that particular unit in the overall game plan, it makes it a lot more limited in how you can build your list. Now, as somebody that takes a lot of enjoyment, experience, a lot of enjoyment, and happy to spend time building a list, I'm quite happy to sit there and treat it as like another axiom of the game, another puzzle involved as part of being a player. But particularly when we think about like a new player wanting to get into a particular faction, maybe they've got the start collecting box, got a few units there, they understand, happy with, they like, they want in the list, and they're planning out, how could I get to 2,000 points? It's a very common question that goes to big streamers when they play the battle reports. What would you suggest I go with next? What if that takes you to 1970 and you don't have a way to spend those extra 30 points because you've already upgraded everything to the extent it can, you've already spent the points it can, and you don't have the models to change your infiltrators to assault intercessors? You can't just cut out a bit of value to then spend it elsewhere without buying another box of models, getting them hobbied up and getting them ready for the game. So for me, again, having that Wargear have a cost gives you less limitation in how you can build a list, especially if there's a cheaper option that will allow you to squeeze in a unit where you otherwise didn't have the points. Now, the next one here is the big one. This is probably the elephant in the room. Faction and internal imbalance. The biggest one there is Deathwing Terminators. They're not just strong, they're ridiculous. 33 points for a 1-up save, 4-up invuln, permanent transhuman, permanent can't fail morale. They've got a Thunderhammer, and if they're pure Deathwing, they get OBSEC. It's far too cheap. It's just far too cheap. I'm not the first one to have that take, and I don't see many of you disagreeing. Now, for me, I think the Deathwing rules should have a point cost to them, like a forced point cost, like being marked for Slaanesh does for Noise Marines, for example. They have to be marked for Slaanesh, and it costs them, but they get a benefit out of it. Wouldn't be unreasonable. Part of the issue here is not that the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield are free. It's that the unit itself has so many rules and just is too cheap. Free Wargear on top just tips it over the edge to absurd. But that's about it that we'll talk about for Deathwing. I think of their units, they just need some fundamental change to the quality of the rules they have, or just the cost of bringing that model with those rules as compared to another subfaction that can bring that model, but it won't have any of those rules. When we compare just assault Terminators versus other Terminators or other quality output units, they hold up unreasonably well and deliver massive punishment in return. So let's first and foremost address that. Chaos Terminators don't have access to Storm Shield, so their Armour of Contempt is gone. Same goes with Blightlords, same goes with Death Shroud. Blightlords and Death Shroud do have the 4-up invuln built in, but they are more expensive than the Assault Terminator is, with the option to have that 4-up invuln. Sure, they've got that extra bit of toughness as well, so I can see the argument for Blightlord Death Shroud being more expensive, not disagreeing with that in the slightest, but the Thunderhammer is arguably better war gear than the Blightlords and Death Shroud can feasibly get access to, other than maybe the Flail. You can really lean into getting Death Shroud output to its maximum with the likes of Biologous Putrefier, but even with that, they don't stand up well into the likes of Assault Terminators, especially Deathwing Assault Terminators. Another positive in their favour, just as well as just being flat good as a unit, just flat, durable and fighty, they all get the same war gear. And this is perhaps a bigger value add than non-competitive players will consider. If you've got 5 hours to play that game with your friend, by all means, take all night if that's what you want to do. But if you're in a competitive environment, perhaps even a chess clock environment, where you running out of the time means you stop playing the game and your opponent just gets to carry on killing and scoring points for another turn or two, you do not want to run out of time. If your opponent gets to roll, 31 attacks with Thunderhammers, see the damage, fine, sorted. But on the backswing, if you're then using your Chaos Terminators, or let's say you go first and you've got all 10 models, you've got your 6 fists, then your 2 chain fists that have got D3 damage, and then you've got your 2 accursed weapons. Not to mention they'll have had different ranged weapons as well. So utilising that unit takes a good amount of time in your turn, and your opponent is only running the clock when they're rolling saves, which... sure, they might have to roll different AP, but you've spent the time rolling the hits and the wounds for those when they're only rolling the saves. On the backswing, they are just rolling 1 set of dice and you just roll 1 set of dice. So they don't waste as much time to force your save roll time as you waste pushing them to the saves on return. So same is true for things like Crisis from Tau, for example. They are incentivized to run 3 different weapons, or at least 2 of one and 1 of another, on their Crisis chassis. If they were to run 3 Fusion Blasters, each Fusion Blaster becomes more expensive added on. And so a squad, let's just say 3 Crisis, if you were to do 3 Fusions, 3 Burst Cannons and 3 Cyclic Ions, that would cost more than if each chassis had 1 of each. Now, in terms of the way you'd roll those dice, arguably that would take about the same amount of time. But of course, models being able to see different targets is a thing. And of course, within Tau, you've got marker lights to consider. So the quality units that Assault Terminators are sort of directly comparable to in that elite slot often have to jump through more hurdles than an Assault Terminator would in terms of just actively doing what they do in the game. So not only are they benefited from Armour of Contempt, not only are they benefited from the free war gear in terms of a Thunderhammer really being a great choice at a free cost, but they also do what they're doing quicker as a player than everyone else. Further to that, Thunderhammer Storm Shield versus Claws is not equivalent. Now, this could have gone in the first point, but I think it fits better here with the internal balance. Thunderhammer Storm Shield is just flat better. Even if we're talking into hordes, sure, you're -1 to hit and you've not got as many attacks going out, but when they get to the wound roll, the Thunderhammer's going to do better than the Lightning Claws, so you'll push more through in that regard. It's also less dice to roll, which is easier, and probably less batches when we're talking about a 10-man squad. It's quite hard to roll, 40 odd, 50 dice in a single go and actually deal with them when you're on the clock. So the Thunderhammer is less attacks, better quality attacks, and when it gets through, will kill stuff. The Claws, of course, do get the rerolls to wound, so there are going to be some scenarios where you'll be grateful of Claws, but the downside is that not having that Storm Shield means that into the sort of unit you would want the Claws output-wise against, on the backswing, when they're hitting you probably with AP1, if we're talking about a horde, the Thunderhammer Storm Shield squad just ignore that because they get +1 to their save on a 2-up save, so they're still on a 2, whereas the Lightning Claw squad would go to 3s. So if they are in the exact scenario where Claws are wanted, they lose more models to the attack from that horde type unit, on average at least. Now, this comparison doesn't work
for Deathwing because Dark Angels cannot take Vanguard Vets. But if we consider that Vanguard Vets with a Thunderhammer and a Storm Shield are more expensive than Assault Terminators, even without jump packs. So they are less durable, otherwise the same base stat line, and get 1 inch extra movement. Now, movement is very important in the game, so with the jump pack included, giving them the ability to drop in, deep strike in, and move 12 per turn, I can totally see Vanguard Vets being worth more than Assault Terminators, because realistically, unless you pay for the teleport homer, once they're in, they've got to foot slog it, and they're not very fast. But of course, many factions, will take Blood Angels, for example, with a +1 to the charge. There are ways that the Assault Terminators can overcome the fact that they're slow and even out that differential with the likes of, say, Vanguard Vets, especially given they are cheaper. So for me, it's baffling that Vanguard Vets are just not an obvious choice in the sort of army where they really ought to be an obvious choice. And it's on the basis that their Wargear makes them more expensive for the equivalent output than a Terminator, which really should be paying for that Wargear. I mean, really, the base cost could just go up, but with my previous point that the claws are arguably worse than Thunderhammer Storm Shield, I think maybe the claws could be free and we have a cost for Thunderhammer Storm Shield as a bit of a compromise. Now, as far as Death Guard, the free upgrades do not really benefit anything other than melee. Sorry, I've said that the wrong way around. They do not really benefit melee other than the flail and the Plague Marines. So obviously your Plague Marines, getting a cleaver in there, getting a flail, a mace, a power fist, obviously that benefits melee. But when we're talking about the Blight Lords or like the Death Shroud, it doesn't really benefit them in melee. Sure, putting a flail on a Blight Lord arguably does, but you do lose a gun as a result of that, and they did still have a melee weapon anyway that they could have used. So for me, it just makes the Blight Lords just come off so much worse that they don't really compete well with these 33-point Assault Terminators. They don't really even out well into Chaos Terminators. They don't really hold up well under mass shooting anymore because Armor Contempt was a really big part of that. They can't take a Storm Shield to mitigate it. It just feels redundant to have the upgrades be free on Blight Lords for me. The Death Shroud, little bit on the fence about that. Getting the chime, it hasn't come up for me yet, I will say, but I feel like there is a scenario where that chime could come up clutch on like a flash outbreak or whatever it might be, just a -1 toughness for some shooting attacks to go into something. But on the whole, I don't feel that free Wargear on Death Shroud really added anything to them. I will say, as far as free Wargear being balanced, Thunderhammer and a grenade launcher on Intercessors, no problem. I think that's pretty good. I think that helps them out in the way they needed help. Devastators, free upgrades for the most part, grav cannons or heavy bolters, yeah, totally. But multi-melters are still 10 points. So they clearly understood that there's no equality in that list there. Sure, a heavy bolter and a grav cannon, it's an extra shot on the grav cannon, and really you want them to have good armor to get the 2 damage, but you come up against a horde and it's just 1 damage at good AP. Realistically, the heavy bolter probably suffers there as well because it's probably wasting damage. So, much of a muchness. There's a reason to run either or. But the multi-melter, clearly a quality destroying weapon, gets rid of big vehicles, big monsters better than most. So, of course, more expensive because it's got that double shoot as well, being a multi-melter rather than a regular melter. But sadly, that logic didn't stretch to when it came to Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, which arguably, if we're talking about a proper tournament layout terrain wise, it does give melee that edge in terms of there not being line of sights directly across the map to just sit and shoot all game. So I think on the grounds that not only Storm Shields went up in value, Thunderhammers arguably did with no Armor of Contempt given they're only AP2. And they clearly had the right idea when it came to, there's only a single model can have a Thunderhammer. They just didn't consider the impact of making it free when there was 10 models that were all getting this upgrade and you're saving about 150 points of value compared to paying for that Wargear upgrade. The last point here really is just a consumer consideration. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of creators out there that get the odd bit for free, or get huge hauls of models and books and whatnot for free. I've only ever paid for anything that I've got, and that's true for most players like myself. But I built all my Plague Marines in 8th edition, so they were all built with bolters and knives, because before that it was considerably more expensive to run them any other way. And now they have no place in my Death Guard list because I can't take them as a cheaper alternative. And so many Marine players will be in the same boat where they've not got the grenade launcher and the hammer on the sergeant, but now they want to run that. And you're either left in the position of not playing as WYSIWYG, which some people may want to and may appreciate from their opponent, and it all being clear as to who's got what. But you're caught between wanting to be WYSIWYG, if that's important to you or your opponent, and having units that are actually worth the cost of investment in them. And so I'm in a position now where I'm like, right, well, I'm probably going to need to buy some more Plague Marines if I want to play on WYSIWYG. And on top of that, this isn't the case for all troop boxes. For example, I believe the Berserkers come in squads of 10. Plague Marines only come in squads of 7, and so you're going to get 2 in there that don't fit the loadout that you want. Sure, if you've got some decent hobbying experience and you're going to be paying for odd bits off second-hand retailers, and you're going to be using green stuff to make sure they all fit appropriately and don't fall to bits on the table, then unless you've got that hobbying experience and know-how, you're left wasting bits of models because you're only able to build 5 out of the 7 possible to fit the loadout you want. So I don't think that's a very consumer-friendly practice. Firstly, in terms of selling certain models in quite low numbers, really. 7, I think, is not really acceptable from a consumer perspective, but it's their business. And on top of that, the fact that we've gone from, these things are really expensive, you can lean into them, but then you're going to have to get your value out of them, so they're not necessarily like an auto pick, to, well, it's all free, so you might as well do all of that, and now your whole collection is largely incorrect for the rules that you're going to use to play them with. That is also true of the way World Eaters are now, obviously going from the CSM codex to their own codex. There's a lot of units in CSM that don't exist there anymore, and they can't take them. So I do feel for those players as well. I do think that although that doesn't fit the free Wargear point of this video, I do think there've been some relatively unfriendly consumer decisions made recently. And then the last point here really is just a take from GW at the end of last year, which is that Marines were doing bad because of new players. Now, first and foremost, I will say they changed the goalposts on those MetaWatch data lists of win rates as it fits their whim. It seems Tzeentch is in charge of who's on that list, because one month we've got Tzeentch Demons in their own category at 70% win rate, and then the following month we've got just Chaos Demons as a whole, so you can't get a gauge for how much impact that was. Is everybody that's running Chaos Demons Tzeentch, and we know that they've come to where they need to be, or did nobody play Tzeentch now because they go, well, it's not worth it now, you've killed my flamers off? It's just not clear from that. So I think really they need to do, firstly, a better job of displaying the data and just break it down by sub-faction. Sure, I don't think we need to go Ulthway, Bael'Tan, every single sub-faction, but I do think with the distinct nature of Astartes and the distinct nature of demons particularly, we ought to be seeing that data. So firstly, I don't think the way they share their data is valid by any scientific standard because they move the goalpost each time. But in terms of addressing, Marines are doing bad because new players, you've literally just made it more complicated. You've given an upgrade of 5 potential options with 5 potential different profiles to somebody who you've defined as a new player being bad at making decisions, and said, yeah, go, have at it. You used to have 1 profile for melee and 1 profile for shooting. Now you've got 2 profiles for shooting, possibly 3, and 2 profiles for melee, but the second profile that can only be on 1 of the models could be one of 5 things. Have at it. You pick what's best. When we were paying for upgrades, it was quite clear that a Thunderhammer was better at the average scenario because it costed more. So you've taken the ability to decide based on cost away and just thrown it in as you might as well take one because they're free now, which actually makes it more complicated both from a list building perspective and from a gameplay perspective, and from a time use perspective. So again, if you're a new player and you fancy going to a tournament, is it actually in your interest to include a Thunderhammer that you might forget you've got, or you've got to go, oh, wait a minute, is it, oh, they've got 3 attacks, but, oh, we didn't charge this turn, so it is still 3 attacks, but they've all got chain swords. So, okay, so yeah, is 4 attacks each on all of them. Oh, and he's the sergeant, so we will have 4 with the Thunderhammer. Oh, wait, you've got a 1 wound model left, so, oh, I should probably attack with the chain swords first. It just adds way more decisions. Now, for somebody like myself that's played a good amount of the game, I can make those decisions pretty quickly. But if the aim here was to help new players that play Astartes out, they've done exactly the opposite, in my opinion, aside from make Deathwing like brain dead playable. And no disrespect to anybody that plays Deathwing, but I think it's fair to say they're easy to play if you go all Deathwing. And just make Assault Terminators super strong, and then presumably replace them with a Primaris equivalent going forwards, which again doesn't feel very consumer friendly to me. One final point, just in case it gets raised, there are lore reasons why exotic Wargear in the 41st millennium is rare, and it stands to reason that Chaos Space Marines don't have all the Wargear they'd want, just by virtue of losing it on the battlefield, brothers that were lost and weren't recovered, but also in some cases that the Wargear is bonded to the user. There is, a plethora of artwork and lore that references, power claws and whatnot, and things like obliterators. Of course, their guns are literally part of their body. But in terms of Terminators, you could make the argument that, well, the 6 of them that have power fists, they've never taken those power fists off in 10,000 years. They're hardwired in now at this point. But the same could be true of the Astartes that are all rocking Thunderhammers now, because if that Thunderhammer gets left on the battlefield due to, a fighting retreat being required, replacing that Thunderhammer is not something that's, 3D printed in a moment's notice. They are all very highly specialized pieces of Wargear. And I feel you could fairly raise the same argument that if Chaos Terminators aren't allowed all the same Wargear, then a squad of 10 Assault Terminator Marines shouldn't all be allowed a Thunderhammer as well. So either way around, I think you can make lore reasons either work or disprove any given rule on the tabletop. I think you've got to appreciate, Imperial Guard being able to run as fast as a Space Marine is utterly bollocks from a lore perspective. But for the sake of the game having reasonable metrics to go on, it kind of has to be that way. But I think they've leaned too hard on the lore reasons for some factions and not hard enough on them for others, or vice versa. So that was everything for me. I've rambled on quite a bit. Hopefully you enjoy this video. As I mentioned earlier, if you've got anything to add, whether you agree or you disagree with me, I would be more than happy to continue the discussion. So please feel free to get involved in the comments and I will read them and get back to you. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.